Hello everyone and welcome to SEW-EURODRIVE's How-To series. We're going to be discussing how to maintain and take care of your product. So let's get into it. Today we're going to be discussing how to replace a stator on an SEW motor. Before we get started with talking about how to actually do this, it's important that we talk about the safety that's involved with this. First, you should disconnect all power sources from this stator. And then the other thing that you need to think about is, do you have the proper PPE? Always make sure you wear the proper PPE before performing any work. Now let's get into this replacement. When we're looking at our components that we have in front of us, the thing that we need to remember is, why did this stator fail? Well, stators are fragile. Stators can break. They also, because of overvoltage, can fry. And so those are cases where you need to replace that particular component. Also, it's important to remember this. If you're going to start taking apart components, you should probably document what it looks like before you start moving things. I like to recommend taking your camera phone out and snapping a few pictures so that you can see things such as where the conduit box is oriented and how the stator is lined up with the rest of the components. The other thing that we need to verify is that this actual replacement stator is the right one, because they can all look about identical, but there's a sticker that's on the stator and it gives you a part number, and that part number should match the part number of the component that you're replacing. All right, so we've got our motor here. The first thing we want to do is, again, we want to confirm that it is de-energized, that we followed all lockout tagout procedures, and now we can begin taking apart the components on the old motor. First, let's take our nut driver and we're going to remove the 4 screws that hold the conduit box lid in place. Now that we have the conduit box lid off, we need to remove the conduit box. And to do this, you need to use a T-Torx bit. They're metric, so you'll need to use the appropriate size based on the motor that you have. And you're going to remove these 4 Torx bits. It's important to remember that you save these screws because you're going to reuse them. Now, if a screw is boogered up, then you would want to replace it, but most of the time you should be able to reuse them. You also want to make sure that you don't drop any of these screws down into the stator, because they're difficult to get out once you've dropped them down into that crevice. Now that I've removed the 4 screws, you should be able to gently lift up and pull the conduit box off of the stator. Now, depending on how long this motor has been installed, it may not come off as easy as that. So be prepared to give it a little bit of a nudge, but at the same time, make sure that you do not damage your stator block here where your terminals are terminated at. Now that we've removed that, the next thing we need to do is take off the old gasket. When you take the gasket off of the stator, it's important that you remember this is a throwaway piece. You don't want to reuse it. Once it's been compressed, then it's going to be not able to be reused. So we'll go ahead and toss that to the side, and we'll use a new one when we get to that point later. Next, we're going to remove the fan guard. To do that, I'm going to lift this up so that you can see it a little bit better. And so we're going to take your nut driver, and this is again a metric nut driver, and the sizes are based on the size of the motor. So you'll need to look that up in our operating instructions to get the exact size. And you're going to remove the 4 nuts. It's always a good idea when you're taking components off to make sure you inspect them to make sure they also are not damaged. And so I'm pulling this fan guard off. I noticed that it's in great shape, so we're going to reuse this as well. Now, to remove the fan, we need to remove a circlip that's on the end. And so to do that, you're going to use a pair of external snap ring pliers. Some people refer them as circlips. I'll call them snap ring pliers. The snap ring that we've taken off can be reused. Just make sure that it does not have any damage to it. Now that we've removed the snap ring, we want to remove the actual fan itself. To do this, sometimes you can just take your hand and just pull it up off of the rotor, and there you go. You've got it off. Now that came off pretty easy. However, sometimes it's not going to come off that easy, and so what you can do is you can use a flathead screwdriver to give it a little gentle pry, and you'll be able to get it loosened, and then this will come off pretty easily that way. Again, you want to inspect all of your parts to make sure that it is not damaged, because you will reuse this fan. Now that we have our fan off, it's time to take off the B-side end shield. To do this, we need to remove the 4 tension rods that are the main fasteners to hold the whole motor assembly together. To do that, we're going to take this T-handle that has your Torx bit on the end, and we're going to remove all 4 of these tension rods. For demonstration purposes, I'm using a T-handle. Some people like to use an electric cordless drill. The one thing that I will caution you against is using some type of impact driver, because that impact can actually strip out the head of the tension rod. Now that I've loosened these all up, I can take them out by hand. Now these tension rods, because they've been removed and reinstalled, it's important that you check the heads to make sure that there is no damage there, that they aren't stripped out, because that could create a difficulty when you're trying to reassemble. These look great, so let's go ahead and continue. The B-side end shield is now ready to be removed. Now the motor that I'm showing you today is just a motor. We do make brake motors, and so in this case there would be a brake in place of this B-side end shield. That's something that you can remove in a similar fashion by taking the tension rods out or bolts. And as always, refer to our operating instructions for your specific equipment so you can make sure that you follow the procedure properly. For this B-side end shield, we're going to go ahead and give it a little pry with a flathead screwdriver. And the best way to do that, because of the fact you're dealing with aluminum, it can be a little fragile, is you want to take your screwdriver and you want to pry it right here where the conduit box was. And you give it a little bit of a pry, and you can see how it's moving up, and you should be able to just gently slide this off. And so here you have your B-side end shield that's been removed. One thing to point out, you'll notice that underneath this B-side end shield is what we call a spring washer. Sometimes it can be stuck in here and it can fall out, and you have to have that component. So make sure that it's either here or it was in here, but regardless, make sure you find it, because you'll need that later. You don't want to see it on your workbench after you've reassembled the motor. That's a problem. Now that I've inspected everything, I'm going to set this to the side. And now here's the part we've been trying to get to, and that is to remove the actual stator itself. So for this, I'm going to turn the motor on its end. Now what came off on the side here is what we call a gasket. This gasket is something that you don't want to reuse as well. We have a new one that we're going to use, just like that rubber gasket on the conduit box. Those 2 components need to be new and not reused when you're replacing a stator. And now we're ready to remove the stator. In this case, you can take a hammer and you can gently tap on the end of the rotor, and you can see how it's separated the motor assembly from the stator itself. Now that I've tapped the rotor and I've separated the stator from the motor assembly, I can now gently slide out the motor rotor from the stator. So we have this out of the way. And here you have your bad stator. So now the bad stator is going to go away, because we don't want to put the bad stator on again. To get started, I'm going to go ahead and put everything back the way it was, and we're ready to reinstall the components. Now that we have all the components disassembled and we're ready to put the new stator in place, it's important that we do a final inspection of the components. And one of the things that I want to point out here is that on this stator, there's an O-ring. That O-ring is pre-installed at the factory when they ship you a new stator. However, you still want to make sure that it's seated properly, it has no cuts or any other types of damage that you might notice. It's also important that as you're putting the components back together, you make sure everything's been cleaned properly. You're reusing a lot of components that were already there, and of course they could be dirty. And so you want to make sure that dust is gone, the grease is gone, so you're starting with a nice clean assembly. To get started, we're going to take the stator and we're going to slide it onto this rotor. This is a critical point in the assembly process, and that is because, as you see here, there's a lot of copper wires. And these copper wires can be damaged very easily, and this can happen when you're trying to slide the stator onto the rotor. And so it's important that you center this up just so, and we'll slide it down gently so that you don't catch the copper wires on any of these components, and then you have a bad stator again. So let's go ahead and get that done. As you're sliding this down, you want to make sure that you line up your bolt holes so that everything is just so. Now we have that in place. It's just following the steps backwards. We're going to start with that spring washer that we removed earlier. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to take this spring washer and we're going to put it centered on the bearing. Next, we're going to get our gasket, the new gasket. Remember, we threw away the old gasket. This gasket is not symmetrical. It actually has a couple of tangs here that are going to lock into the stator itself. So we're going to slide that on, make sure it's lined up properly, and now we're ready to install the B-side end shield. The B-side end shield has that very similar cutout that had noticed here with the gasket, and this is going to allow us to be able to make sure that everything is lined up properly. So it's not a symmetrical flange, it's designed to fit just one way. So we're going to take this and we're going to slide it down over the rotor, and it should slide down nice and smooth. And there you go, you have it in place. Now, in this case, it popped on just right, but you may need to take a hammer and give it a few gentle taps if you want to make sure it's seated properly. Don't hit it too hard. Again, these components are aluminum. Now that we have that in place, it's time for us to install our tension rods. We're going to go ahead and take, again, the tension rods that were in the old motor stator. We're going to put them down. Make sure they go down into the holes, and you want to give it a few turns just to make sure that the threads are lined up so you don't have any cross threading before you go to tighten the tension rods with a tool. Before we begin tightening down the tension rods, I'd like to point out that all of SEW-EURODRIVE's components have torque specs when you're talking about fasteners such as nuts and bolts and screws. In this particular motor design that we have here in front of us, we're demonstrating how to do the process, and so I'm going to use a T-handle. But if you were doing this in the field, you'd want to use a torque wrench in order to torque it down to the proper value. So let's go ahead and put this tension rod assembly back in place. I'm going to start at one corner, and you can start at any corner that you would like, and you want to just give it a little bit of a spin so you get it down, not all the way tight, because you're going to work yourself around, and you always go diametrically opposed. So we started here. We're going to go over to the opposite tension rod and we're going to tighten it down a little bit. Now, before I finish tightening this up, I always like to visually inspect the joints to make sure that everything's close to the final position, because you don't want to use the tension rods to bring the pieces together, because what you're doing is you're getting a false reading on your torque value. Everything should already be together before you begin to do your final tightening sequence. So now we have our tension rods to the right spec. You can see everything's closed up, no gaps in your joints, and so we're ready now to install the fan. SEW-EURODRIVE fans have a flat spot design in them. That way it doesn't spin on the shaft, and this would match up with the flat spot that you have here in the rotor. So we're going to go ahead and line that up, and we'll go ahead and slide this down. Again, it may not go down that easy, and so it's okay. You can take a little tap with a hammer, make sure it's seated properly, and now you're ready to install the snap ring. It's important to remember that when we're looking at the snap ring, there's an opening in this snap ring or circlip. You want to make sure that opening is opposite of the flat spot in your rotor. And so let's go ahead and do that. That little click you heard means that it seated itself properly. Always inspect your snap rings and circlips to make sure that they're closed all the way. That way you know they're in the groove and they're doing their job, and that's keeping things in place. Now that we have our fan installed, it's time to put our fan guard back in place. Now, to do that, we're going to take our 4 screws that we had taken out before, and we're going to thread them in just a little bit into the end of the B-side end shield. Now that I have those in place, it's time for us to slide the fan guard onto the motor assembly. Now, our fans, again, are not symmetrical. It may be difficult to see, but there's actually a little bit of a curve on the one end. You're going to want to put that towards the conduit box. So wherever the conduit box is, you want to make sure that that goes there. You just slide this onto the stator. The slots are going to line up with the screws, and now you're ready to tighten your 4 screws. We're going to use our nut driver for that, and so we'll just start on one side, go to the opposite side, and then do the same on the other 2. Now that I've got the stator laid down, it's important for us to install the conduit box back in its original orientation. Remember that picture that you took? You need to reference it so that you know everything goes back exactly as it was. Before we put that conduit box on, we also need to remember that we got rid of the original gasket between the conduit box and the stator. You always want to use a new gasket whenever you're doing this procedure. So I've got my new gasket. I'm going to lay it down here onto the stator, and then I'm going to take my conduit box and I'm going to place it onto the stator itself. Now, there's a lot of room here, but some designs, the wires are going to be pretty cramped as far as when you're trying to slide that conduit box on there. So it's very, very important that you do not crimp any of the wires or crush the wires when you're trying to put the conduit box back in place. In this case, I've inspected visually that all the wires are out of the way, and now I'm ready to begin installing these screws. So we're going to place the screws one by one back into their original holes, and now let's go ahead and begin the tightening process. One cool feature of SEW-EURODRIVE motors is that a lot of the components and fasteners are very similar, and so you can utilize that same Torx bit for the different motor sizes for not only the tension rods, but also for the conduit box screws. Just like when you were tightening the tension rods, it's important to follow that diametrically opposed pattern. So you're going to go one corner to the other corner, and then with the other two you do the same. And now we are ready to install the cover. Before I do anything else though, I want to make sure that everything looks right. Again, your conduit box is in the right location. Everything looks solid. Again, check your motor again, that there's no gaps. And then we're ready to put the cover back on. All right, now we're at the point where we're going to put the cover back on. We're demonstrating this for you, but for those of you that are out there in the field or in your factory, you want to make sure that this is where you are extra safe, that your circuits are de-energized and you still have everything locked out and tagged out, because you're going to be applying your power to the conduit box, and then you're going to put the cover on. We're going to act like we did that, and now we're going to put our cover back on. Again, this has a gasket, but that gasket is designed to be reused, so it's okay. You're just going to place it down on top of it. Make sure that all 4 of your screws are into the threaded holes, and we're going to tighten this up. Like all the other ones, I like to give it another go around to make sure everything is tightened up properly, as that gasket starts to compress. All right, so now we've successfully exchanged the old stator with the new stator, and we have a completely assembled SEW-EURODRIVE motor that's ready to be used again. Before we do that, let's talk about some things that you should keep in mind at your site. Make sure that before you've re-energized this motor, everything is wired up properly. You want to make sure that you followed all of the SEW-EURODRIVE technical specifications and operating instructions so that everything operates in an efficient and safe manner. But that leads me to something else that sometimes we don't think about, and that is, why did this motor fail in the first place? It's so important that you know why the motor burned up or why it was damaged, so that you do not repeat that process again with this brand new motor stator that we've installed. If you're interested in learning more about SEW-EURODRIVE's components, products, or solutions, please go to SEW-EURODRIVE.com. Together, we drive the world.